All right. Good evening, everyone. It looks like it's about 7 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started for the sake of being on time. Um, my name, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first MaryTalk of our 8th season. My name is Philip Duggins. I am with the Alumni Engagement Office here at Mary Washington, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We are excited to host a sizable audience for tonight's presentation, which includes over 300 alumni, students, parents, and friends from across the country and beyond. As with past lectures, there will be a time after the presentation for our guests to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A icon below and submitting there, or vote for other submitted questions to help them rise to the top of the list. At this time, I'd like to introduce Sean O'Brien, class of 2009, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Sean, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks everyone for coming. So good evening. As Philip said, my name is Sean O'Brien. I'm a 2009 graduate of Mary Washington, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my former professor and my friend, Dr. Anand Rao, for tonight's MaryTalk. I'm pleased Dr. Rao asked me to do today's introduction. AI is a topic I spend quite a bit of time on in my role leading cloud services at Internet2, the National Research and Education Network in the United States, helping research and higher education institutions adopt and leverage advanced technologies. Dr. Rao will tell you in a minute whether he thinks AI is all hype or truly transformative, but my belief is that AI is certainly disruptive. While not a new technology in and of itself, AI is becoming increasingly accessible through things like generative AI. And as new technologies become more accessible, they're always more disruptive. I think back to my time attending UMW at the emergence of the smartphone era, as students and faculty and staff moved from BlackBerries to iPhones, and how that was a controversial topic, whether you would let a smartphone in a classroom, in a lecture, let alone whether you would use it as a tool for instruction or a tool for teaching and learning. But there were faculty like Dr. Rao who saw opportunities to leverage new technologies like the smartphone for teaching and learning. And of course, today, smartphones are ubiquitous in everything we do. It's basically in my hand right now. Leveraging emerging technologies it presents, in my view, a wonderful opportunity for the Academy to teach the next generation of the workforce how to appropriately leverage these new technologies. That's something that's been a cornerstone of UMW going back for more than a decade with things like UMW blogs, a domain of one's own, and so many other projects. So I think it's only fitting tonight that as another generational technology has emerged, someone like Dr. Rao is here to talk about it. Our speaker today is a highly engaged faculty member, and I know many of you know him already. But for those of you who don't, let me briefly introduce him. Dr. Anand Rao is a professor of communication and department chair at the University of Mary Washington. He started integrating AI applications into his courses in the spring and is currently teaching a digital studies course on generative AI. He is the co-editor and contributor to the March 2023 book, ChatGPT, Navigating the Impact of Generative AI Technologies on Educational Theory and Practice, and is a frequently invited speaker on the impact of generative AI in education. He's given more than 50 scholarly presentations and has run workshops around the world for faculty on the teaching of communication across the curriculum and for middle and high school students on argumentation and debate. He was the founding director of Harvard Debate Council's summer workshop on public speaking and argumentation, and co-founder of the Millennial Speech and Debates Institute's summer workshop. And if that doesn't sound impressive enough, he's a faculty member who, in my experience, and I know I speak for many friends too, takes an active interest in ensuring that students are engaged and successful, which, as we all know as UMW alumni, really the secret sauce of the UMW experience. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker and my good friend, Dr. Anand Rao.
Sean, thank you so much for that kind invitation and for joining me tonight. It really meant a lot to have you here, given your role in your career and all that you've contributed to UMW. I really appreciate you being here joining me. And my thanks to Philip and all of the Alumni Association and all of you tuning in. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that I'm doing and the work our students are doing and talk about this topic that certainly has me buzzing. And I think there's a lot here to explore. As Sean mentioned, as you know, the question is generative AI all hype or truly transformative? Sean's right. It's certainly disruptive. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. But I don't think it is certainly all hype. You know, we have experienced a bit of that over the last year. When November 22 came about and ChatGPT was released, I had been studying AI for a long time, but I'd never really seen anything like ChatGPT as a chatbot and its capabilities with generative AI to be able to produce such great text, to be so responsive and engaging. And it was a lot of fun to play around with. And I certainly wasn't alone. There was a lot of buzz around it immediately. I just remember friends texting me and asking if I tried this out. And over the coming months, then, you know, getting involved in a lot of faculty discussions and leading some of the webinars and invited talks about incorporating this technology into the classroom. At the same time, I think we all saw such a huge reaction in the media to generative AI and the talk of ChatGPT and what does this mean for the next step in different areas of society. I think it's no surprise that, of course, you get that tidal wave of hype of that reaction. And eventually you kind of wonder, is this all just a wave of hype? Is there anything else really happening here? And by the end of the spring, we saw articles like this one, MIT Sloan Management Review in late May, saying, don't get distracted by the hype around generative AI. Not saying that it wasn't a real issue to be considering and thinking about how to apply it, but they thought it might just be a tech bubble. Or Wired magazine in early June, mid-June, talking about, you know, the worst part of the AI hype cycle, feeling a lot of hype burnout. This was an article that referenced, and it shows this picture of Paul McCartney, who had announced that they'd taken old vocals of John Lennon and using AI, were able to clean it up and be able to repurpose it for new tracks. Exciting for some, a little disconcerting for others. And then when we found that ChatGPT usage started dropping in late spring or getting into June and into July, there were articles like this from Forbes that asked, is the artificial intelligence craze over? I think that was a little premature. Even though ChatGPT was losing some users, it wasn't as increased usage as it had been the previous months. There were some questions about what that really meant. There was an interesting post from a Google Cloud engineer and an expert in deep learning, and this is Francois Chollet, and it was on Twitter. I think it was still called Twitter at that point in June. And he shared this graphic talking about the interest of ChatGPT. You can see, of course, there was zero use until November, and then it went up. And then some point in early May, late April, early May, it started dropping. He also included information about usage for Minecraft at the same time. Interestingly enough, to say, perhaps is there some relationship between the two? This was posted in June. He posted it again just a few days ago. He said, now that it's September, we can put our June hypothesis to the test. And it checks out perfectly. ChatGPT in blue, Minecraft in red. And the answer, of course, that some people have been saying is that usage went down because it was the end of the academic year. There are a lot of students, but not just students, but faculty and teachers and administrators and members of the university communities and K through 12 communities that have been making a lot of use of ChatGPT as a technology for a lot of good reasons. Some of it might be irresponsible and some of it we need to address, but many of us are really excited about the possibilities here. And you could see that blue line starting to trend up again as classes resumed. But I think we also have to be cautious about, you know, lumping all of generative AI into ChatGPT, referring to it all as ChatGPT. It's a wonderful tool and it's a lot of fun to play with, but it has serious limitations. And I think, as most of you are aware, if you've played around with it before, you know that the training materials were limited up through 2021. So if you asked it a question about something more recent, couldn't answer. It just didn't have that training material in its system. It also was not initially and isn't currently connected to the internet. So it will not pull in current web searches. And it makes mistakes, what they call hallucinations, which I think is just a wonderful phrase to be able to describe it, getting it wrong. It makes things up. And that's true for any generative AI model, but perhaps even more so for ChatGPT because it isn't grounded in what else is going on the internet and with other more current searches. We're lulled into a sense of kind of false security, thinking that this is all that generative AI really had to offer. Instructors were giving the sense that, well, it'll make up sources, but I can tell if it's written by generative AI because it just doesn't sound quite right. It's not quite as good as student writing. And unfortunately, that lulled us in this false sense of security when other platforms were being developed at the same time. I want to talk about some of those other platforms and talk about other applications that present great opportunity in generative AI, as well as talk about some of the perils, and then eventually get to some discussion about specific applications, things that we could be looking for in the future for the use of generative AI in some different areas, a couple of examples from healthcare and business, but then also in education. Now, when we think about generative AI right now, and we consider different platforms, ChatGPT, as we saw, is on the uptick in terms of usage, but there are other platforms that have made generative AI ubiquitous. They're available to everyone, and not just by seeking it out. You don't have to go to a site and search through a chatbot. You can use it through a lot of the tools we're already familiar with. Google, for instance. This is something that many of us use as a landing page or start there when we're doing a search or exploring a topic. And for many of us now, that button down below the search bar includes this prompt: try AI-powered overviews when you search. And for many people, this has been rolled out. And it means that when I do a search on Google, not only do I get those links, but I also get a box next to it that explains with generative text what else I might like to know about that topic. So it gives me some more context. It gives me a little bit more information about it. And that's just a way that it's incorporating generative AI into the search. So it's not the same limitation ChatGPT had. But then if you move into something like Google Docs, you see that they've integrated generative AI into something that, like this shows, help me write. And if I open up a Google Doc and that button pops up, I can click on it and I can say, help me write an email to students explaining to them how to prepare for the next assignment. And I can give it some details and it can help me generate that text really easily. I think this is an important distinction because we assume that students or people in business have to go and seek out the tools, but we're at the stage now where these tools are being integrated into the platforms we're all familiar with. Google, of course, has its own chatbot called Bard, one that I played around with in the spring, and I thought it was okay. There were some concerns about its limitations, but I'll tell you, the developments over the last several months have really blown me away. Over the summer, they incorporated search, so it'll bring back links for specific articles. And just yesterday, they added something called extensions, which allows me, and I enabled extensions yesterday. I've been playing with it for like 24 hours, and I'm just reeling with the possibilities. It allows you to incorporate YouTube, Google Maps, Google Flights, Google Hotels, so that you can do something within the chatbot to be able to plan an itinerary for a trip, for instance, and it'll give you all the information so you can book the trip right away. But it also allowed me to turn on an extension that gives it access to all of my workspace materials. So that includes my Google Drive, Gmail, any other materials I have through the calendar. So I started doing searches where I asked for summaries based on my Google Docs. So if it had drafts of papers that I'd written, I could ask for a summary or talk about connections between them. And it not only generated the text, but it did it in a way that was directly drawing from those documents. So it starts to address the concern about hallucinations, and it starts to add a quality that gives me kind of a personal assistant mode. I can start to use it to be able to collect information, to be able to find better information, and not just as a search, but also to be able to generate new additional information. I'm just scratching the surface on what it can do, but this is a tool that is just made available yesterday to most people that already had access to Bard, and it looks like it's going to be available to everybody shortly. Now, Microsoft, of course, is not left out of this. And Microsoft has been working very closely with OpenAI to the tune of a $13 billion investment over the last several years so that they could take the underlying AI model known as GPT, the generative pre-trained transformer, and use it not just for ChatGPT, which OpenAI runs, but they've been using it for Bing. Microsoft a long time has tried to compete with Google, and so they incorporated GPT into Bing so that when you did a search, you could do a regular search or you could do a Bing chat where it will bring back search results in text narrative form. So it would bring back maybe a paragraph explaining the answer to your question with embedded links or footnotes so you can go and find more information about it. And the other thing that's exciting about this model is that you see in the middle here, it says this conversation style. This is where you can control for that hallucination or the kinds of output that you're looking for. Computer scientists talk about this as a temperature within an AI model. If you want something that's really going to be closer to the facts, just what that finds in terms of the research results, you might want more precise results. If you want something that's going to be a really creative, like write me a haiku about giving a MaryTalk, then I'd probably select the more creative button. This gives me a little more control over what I'm doing with the tool. And again, this is available for free for everybody to have access to. Not only is that available for somebody to go and seek it out, but Microsoft wants to make sure that you're using their other products. And they've built this into Copilot and a lot of their other Office products. They do that on the enterprise level, but they want to make sure that we come to their browser and use Microsoft Edge. This is an advertisement they had for Microsoft Edge, and they talk about this sidebar. I took a screenshot of one yesterday just to show you what it looks like. And this is one where I made sure I was logged out of the system. So it's not because I had early access or special provisions to have access to it. This is for anybody to access. You'll notice it looks like the Bing search page on the left. And then on the right is this composition bar, the sidebar. It has the chat option, but they also make available the compose function. So I can put in a prompt and say, write about, here it gives me the idea advertisement for my 2010 Camry. Let's assume I'm selling that online and I need some help putting that text together. Or maybe it's tell me a little bit about a topic that I'm trying to prepare for, or help me brainstorm a topic. It also lets me set the tone. So I point this out to suggest that these tools are now ubiquitous. They're available for everybody to use, freely available. And I think we're going to see more and more of this kind of integration so that it's easy to access it. It's far more expansive than what ChatGPT had. And we're starting to get a better sense of how generative AI can be used across the board in different ways. Now, as we consider some of the limitations, often we only talk about what it can currently do. And it makes sense because we have to think about how that's going to be applied. And in class, we talk a lot about what the current platforms have to offer. How do you compare them? What do you do with them? But I also want to make sure my students are not missing the future for the present. So in the generative AI class that I'm teaching, we talk quite a bit about how do you forecast where this is going to go or what might happen. This is a picture from Professor Ethan Mollick, who is a professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He primarily works with graduate students in courses about entrepreneurship, and has done a lot of work with AI in those courses. This is a quote that he posted along with a funny picture where he used AI to put a tinfoil hat on him. And he said this: the worst AI you're ever going to use is the one you're using right now. And I think generally this is true. It's astonishing to me to think about how quickly things have changed, not just over the last year or over the last 6 months. As I was preparing this talk, I found that a month ago, it was a very different talk than what I thought it was going to be last spring when Philip reached out and asked me about this. And over the last week, when I had access to Bard and I found out about the new Google model that's coming out in December, and I thought about some of the new studies that were just released in the last week or two, this talk has evolved and changed because the entire ecosystem around AI is changing. It's adapting, it's developing, and there are new capabilities all the time. That's promising. There's a lot of potential there. That also should give us a pause for concern, because sometimes we have to worry that maybe we're moving a little too quickly. And we should talk a bit about some of those concerns. We will shortly. Now, I've said that, of course, we're looking at tools far beyond what ChatGPT has to offer. But I do want to talk a little bit about how much some of this has changed in terms of capabilities. So if we consider that ChatGPT was based originally on GPT 3.5, and the free version still uses 3.5, that's a very good model. And when that came out a few months ago, Ethan Mollick had some researchers test GPT-3 to see how it would perform on these different exams. So you can see the GRE exams on the left, the quantitative as well as the qualitative, a host of different AP tests, AP statistics, bio, US history, chemistry, psychology, physics, the SAT test, math, and also language, the LSAT, and the bar exam. Now, 3.5 performed pretty well in some of these. Look at AP Psychology, it was performing at above an 80% on that test, or in SAT Language, close to 90%. When you think about these AP scores, for many of those tests, if you score a 60%, you might get a 5, which is the highest score possible. These are difficult, challenging tests, and we all know how tough a test like the SAT is. Then you consider something like the LSAT or the bar exam that lawyers have to pass in order to be able to practice the law. It's not surprising that it didn't do very well, maybe a 10%. But when you get to GPT-4, you see a lot of advancement. This is what they found when they started using the newer model. This is the model that's available with Bing for free and for the paid version of ChatGPT. So you can put any of the questions for these tests in, and you're likely to get these similar results. The GRE scores go to at least 80 to close to 100% for both sections. AP scores are well above the threshold you would need for a 5. The SAT score is getting close to a perfect score. LSAT is above 90. And look at that bar exam result, from about a 10% to 90%. When you think 3.5 to 4, it doesn't seem like that big of a jump. But really what you're talking about is an exponential increase in the training capabilities and the resources that went into the development of that model. And it's astonishing to see those results. Now, this is all just text-based. I want to talk about some other opportunities and some other applications when you think about what AI, generative AI in particular, has to offer. This is a quote from a noted computer scientist, Andrej Karpathy, who in January said the hottest new programming language is English. And he was saying that because so many of these AI models now can help somebody who's working in code develop new code or perfect their code, make it better. Sometimes it can work in whole cloth and develop the entire program, but more often than not, it's working on bits and pieces to be able to lead to better coding and better programs. So it's not just text-based, but it's also coding-based in terms of generative AI models. There are lots of different video applications too. And I wanted to show you one example in particular, because this is one a friend showed me recently. It's free to try out in Video AI. And it's a little rudimentary. It's not generating the video, but what it does, it'll take a text prompt. You ask it to produce something, and then it'll produce the video based on what it is that you asked it to do. Now, my son who's in high school the other day had an assignment where he and friends were making a book trailer for the book 1984. I said, let's see what this technology could do. So I tried this out on Monday in class. And I said at the beginning of class, I want to show you how this works. We're going to test it. I put in only the text that's at the bottom of the screen. Produce a trailer for the book 1984. The trailer should be ominous in tone and 30 seconds long. That's all I added. Then I hit enter and I let it do its work. I went back to something else. We started talking about other things in class. I came back about 15 minutes later and it had a video done. So it was done in less than 15 minutes and it was available. Let me show you what it looked like.
In a world where Big Brother is always watching, freedom is a forgotten dream. Enter the dystopian society of George Orwell's 1984, a chilling tale of rebellion and love in the face of omnipresent surveillance. Discover how far one man will go to reclaim what's been lost. 1984, a glimpse into a world that might just be too close for comfort. Dive into the pages, but remember, Big Brother is watching. I'm not really sure
that the garbage dumpster is the best representation of the book, but it generally did a pretty good job. And when I think about what I probably would have been able to do in high school, it's far beyond what I would have expected. It's not ready for prime time by any means, but you already have tools freely available. You pay a little bit, you can have the watermark removed. But I was able to download that. I could post it on YouTube. I had a friend try it out for his debate team to recruit new students, and it was very good. I tried making one that would recruit students into the CDS major, and I explained it's a college level program, and it included video of students in a classroom that look like they're in college, in the library, working with technology. It adapted really well, and it's just taking from a bank of video clips that it had, but that model was able to generate that really easily. So we're looking at different multimodal approaches that's not limited just to text. Of course, we have artificial intelligence and generative art, and we've all seen examples of some of the art produced. This is one that a friend produced. It's creating this human-like artwork that's similar to how GPT creates coherent speech and text. It uses this artificial neural network and it generates it. It's been trained on other art and other visuals. There are a lot of questions about what that means. There are copyright concerns, certainly. What is it being trained on and how does it get access to those materials? Different companies have taken different approaches. I know Adobe, for instance, with its tool, it made sure that it was only training its model on content that it owned the copyright to so that it could control then the output. That's not always true for others. And so there are a lot of open legal questions about this. Is this theft of pre-existing art? Are there biases that come from the algorithm and the action that's being put forward by the model? And those are real concerns. And is this real art or is it just mimicry? Well, you know, there are a lot of questions about that, but it is pretty astonishing to see what it does produce. And we're going to see this refined and develop further. DALL-E, which is the OpenAI tool that's been available for over a year, had a really great interface. It came out before ChatGPT, and it produced pictures like this that were really interesting to see. You could tell they were AI, but they were really interesting models. There's another platform that I wanted to show you briefly that I've been playing around with because you've probably heard of it, Midjourney. It's one that's run on a Discord server, but it's really pretty easy to learn how to use. I haven't spent a lot of time. I've just kind of scratched the surface on producing some visuals. But I did find out about a week ago about a plugin that you can use that's called InSwapper. And this is used with Midjourney to do something a little more advanced than I'd seen in generative AI art before. What this allows you to do is take a picture, and I use this picture, the same one we used to advertise tonight's talk, and I put it into InSwapper. I figured it's pretty safe. It's publicly available already. It might have already trained on it. And I had it then analyze the picture. And I just included one picture. It took about 5 minutes for it to analyze it, and then it was ready to go. Then I went back to Midjourney, and I had to produce some pictures. The first one, I gave the prompt that's on the screen: cinematic action hero standing on a rooftop, holding onto the bottom of a helicopter, facing the camera. Then I used InSwapper to change the face, and it came up with this. I didn't know I'd look so good as an action hero. It's pretty astonishing, given the only picture that I had was one of me smiling as my headshot for school. Now I look like an action hero. I always wanted to be a Jedi, so I thought I'd create a Jedi picture with Midjourney. And then you have me as a Jedi with my lightsaber and a very full head of hair, as my students and my kids have teased me about. I thought maybe I should come a little closer to home. I'm a college professor. Let's try and create something that's a little more built into the past. So I said, let's do a college professor, male professor lecturing in a large lecture hall set in the 50s, everybody dressed formally. Now, one thing I want to note about this is that there's probably some algorithmic bias here. I said a male professor. I didn't say anything about the audience. And so there's probably some bias built in to assume it's going to be all men. That's certainly a concern and exhibits some of what we were highlighting a minute ago. When I had it do the face swap, this is a picture of me then giving a lecture, and it looks something like me. And it's astonishing because it's a different side. It's a different angle of the same of the picture that I had with a very different look on my face. A couple others I tried out. Of course, there's a very favorite professor in the movies, Indiana Jones. I always wanted to look like Indiana Jones. And this one probably did a better job than the others. I look a little rough. I don't know that I handled the expedition as well as Indiana Jones did, but I was pretty happy with the results and the way it did this so easily. I seriously only spent about 15 minutes of watching a YouTube video, putting it in InSwapper and trying it out. The only one that I tried, of course, was I had to be Superman. And it's like looking in a mirror. It's just amazing to see the results. And that's my new profile picture for my group text with my family. I just want to show this to say that gives you a glimpse at what this technology is capable of already when we're thinking about using it just kind of widespread. Not a ton of controls. There's a lot of fine tuning that could be there. But given that it's changed so rapidly over a few months, what's going to happen over the coming months and over the coming years in terms of what we can do with generative AI art, with video, with coding, and with text? I want to make sure that we do talk a bit about some of the peril of generative AI, some of the concerns. This is, of course, something that I'm not going to be able to go into the depth that it really deserves. I hope that we're able to have some other talks about this in the future and that you're able to explore this further. There are a lot of real concerns about this. One of them, as we're thinking about elections coming up and lots of influence online, would be deepfakes. This is a video that was posted by French DJ David Guetta a few months ago when he talked about putting together an audio clip to make it sound like Eminem.
This is the future rave sound. I'm getting lost in an underground. This is the future rave sound. I'm getting lost in an underground.
Eminem, bro. There's something that I made as a joke and it works so good, I could not believe it. I discovered those websites that are about AI. Basically, you can write lyrics in the style of any artist you like. So I typed, write a verse in the style of Eminem about future rave. And I went to another AI website that can recreate the voice. I put the text in that and I played the record and people went nuts.
I think we've seen other examples where people are cloning President Biden's voice or former President Trump's voice. I've seen a couple where they have a conversation between the two, playing a game of cards or doing something fairly innocuous. We have to be concerned about how that's going to be used potentially for other malicious intent, and deepfakes are a real concern. Now, I remember seeing this study in the spring talking about AI-generated images and fake photos, and it found through a quantitative study that about 40% of the time, humans were not able to tell a real photo from an AI-generated fake photo. And these are obviously much better photos than those Midjourney photos I made of me as Superman or Indiana Jones. There's some very convincing photos. Now, at the same time, I'll have to admit, I was wondering, yeah, but would I really fall for that? I'm not so sure that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them. But it wasn't long after that I remember being online and I was on YouTube and I saw a link for this event. And it said it was from OpenAI, talked about the future of AI, and it had these speakers. And you could see Elon Musk on the left and another founder of Twitter and famous investor that's speaking. And I watched for a few minutes and I sent a link to somebody saying, look at this. This looks, something's a little bit off, but it looks pretty convincing. I couldn't tell from the video or from the audio that it wasn't real. The only thing that really clued me in was that first I was suspicious when it said OpenAI with a space between Open and AI, because I remember looking at their site, there was no space between the two on their YouTube page. And they only had 5,000 subscribers. So I think maybe something's up. A few minutes later, the site was taken down and the video had been playing for like an hour at that point. I expected that there'd be an article about this. Somebody would be writing about it. And when there was nothing, I asked another colleague who's an expert in disinformation and computer science, and they said this happens all the time. There are a lot of these fake videos that are being put out. The technology is so good for deepfakes that people will post this. They have the QR code that people think it's real. They use the QR code and they end up investing money and losing it because of these kinds of sites. And there's so many, it's not even a story anymore. So this is a real concern as we're getting into elections. We're thinking about public officials being victims of deepfakes. How are we going to be able to tell that it's real or not real in the future? Some other concerns about generative AI, and this just touching on a bit of the concern, but it's certainly worth exploring and to read more about. The environmental impact is a very real one. As you can imagine, any of these server farms, these networks are drawing a tremendous amount of power to be able to keep these computers going. And we've had these for a long time. We've had, Google server farms. We have Microsoft Google server farms that are running. They use a lot of power. AI, though, uses a lot more because it's doing more advanced computing. It's having to run more GPUs and more intensive technologies, so that it's using a lot more energy, and so it has a greater environmental impact. The other thing about this that is something that was kind of shocking was to hear about the amount of water that's used by some of these. And one researcher found that they estimated for every 5 queries on ChatGPT, a server network like this will need about 16 ounces of water. So there are a couple of communities that have these big buildings and they have server farms, and they're concerned because they're seeing there's a lot more water being drawn primarily to cool the equipment and run air conditioning systems than they ever expected. I don't think this is going to persist. I think that when we have new technologies, we're often using them in inefficient ways early on, but this is something that needs to be really considered, and certainly for regulatory consideration and for businesses to think about how do they do this more efficiently and more responsibly. Then, of course, we could really spend a lot of time talking about AI safety, including privacy protections. When it's training a model, how much private information is being ingested by that model? How are privacy concerns for users being protected or not being protected, as well as the bias? If we have biased material that's going in that it's being trained on, we're going to expect biased results. It's garbage in, garbage out. And this is the same discussion we've had in academia for a lot of years. If we primarily draw upon an established canon of literature that is all produced from people that are highly privileged and not really representative of the societies they were in, then we have to expect that what we're teaching our students is going to reflect that. And we want to make sure that we're more responsive to look at issues of representation and looking at how people see themselves in the work that's being done. I think this is even a double concern within AI, because as I was talking with a colleague about this earlier today, when somebody sees something produced by AI, it looks very authoritative. It's not just that they hear somebody talking about it, they see something written and they assume that it's probably true. And I think that's going to be a real concern for our students and for our classrooms as we consider bias in the algorithms and the output that we're looking into. These are all things that need to be looked into in far greater detail. I think in addition to that, it's also what we don't know that we should be concerned about. For instance, there are concerns about threats to society or even existential threats. This is a picture of Geoffrey Hinton, who is often referred to as kind of the godfather of AI. He was a researcher decades ago at the University of Toronto, worked for Google for the last couple of decades, and left Google this last spring because he wanted to be able to speak more openly about some of the dangers that he saw with current AI models. Now, some were a little critical. Why didn't he speak up earlier? But I think what he saw is that there was such an advancement in some of the new models that were being developed and the capabilities and how they could be used maliciously without proper oversight that he wanted to be able to speak openly about this. And he's speaking about those issues. Is this an existential threat? We've seen the sci-fi movie scenarios I don't know that I'm overly concerned about that long-term threat, but certainly some of the threats about how it could be used irresponsibly or maliciously, or if we do get to the point where it starts having a little more control over systems that we don't really intend for an AI model to have, what will those consequences be? Those are some of the concerns that we can forecast. We can see them coming, and maybe we can do something about them. This article from Fast Company in last May really opened my eyes, though, to the unknown. We should fear AI, but for the reasons that we aren't sure. Think about it. Some of these AI models work so well and they're so persuasive and convincing because they're able to do things that we aren't able to do. So think about like a chess model. You know, a computerized chess model is very effective at playing against humans to the point that, you know, they have to really be careful to make sure that somebody's not cheating using a chess model. And one of the reasons why, or at least in some instances, as I understand it, they're so successful is that those models employ strategies humans would never employ. They do things, they have moves that a human would never do. And for some reason, we have kind of that built-in bias. We have that understanding of the game that the model doesn't have. So if it's able to perform that way with something as simple as a game, what's it going to be doing when it's developing something more advanced within business processes or governmental processes or in education? And we can't foresee it. It's the unknown, after all. We have to keep an open eye to this and to think about not just how do we forestall future events that might be deleterious, but how do we try and keep an eye on what's happening now so that if we need to make corrections and changes, we can do so. We have to be open to what's going on and have a better understanding of what's happening. There's a concept that's referred to as explainability within AI models. And often with technology, we view it as a black box. You know, most of us don't really know exactly how the technology works, but we hope somebody does. And hopefully the scientist or the technician or whoever's running it does understand exactly what happens when I'm using my cell phone, for instance, or we're communicating via satellite. Somebody knows exactly what happens. In the AI models, there are often instances where the computer scientists do not know. They'll admit that there are sometimes things happen that they can't explain. And that level of explainability is really key for this very reason that this article is talking about. If we can't explain what's happening now, why are we developing it further to further do things that we can't explain? It's not to say, I wouldn't suggest that we don't develop AI further, but we need to get a better grip on explainability, get a better sense of what's going on under the hood so that we can then address concerns as they come about and be critically reflective about what these practices are and what we're going to be doing. Leads to regulation and oversight. This is a picture of the meeting that occurred just last week in the Senate, where 20 of the most prominent AI builders, researchers, and also some civil rights advocates, labor leaders met with many of the members of Congress, really just the Senate, for this closed-door meeting. And they talked about the need for governmental action. And most of the AI leaders are saying that there is a need for regulation. There needs to be some oversight because they recognize some of the threats now. The critical take on that is it's regulatory capture, because if these companies already have the model and now they call for regulation, they still have their model. The regulation might keep other companies from developing it. But even if that's true, we are going to need some regulation. We are going to need governmental oversight so that there are better practices, so we have the best practices being used in the industry. And we know that when something's coming up, we have some way of oversight and regulatory controls to, you know, hopefully prevent the worst that could happen from that. And that's another area that we should certainly look into. Unfortunately, I think the Congress is poorly equipped. I think they're now trying to get the tools that they need to figure out how to manage this. But that's a tough ask. And that's going to have to come over the next months and years to figure out exactly what that regulation and oversight control is going to look like. Now, AI potential. And I want to just touch on a few quick examples to say that when we think beyond what generative AI is in terms of what we're used to, ChatGPT or Bard or Bing, there's so many other opportunities here that I think it presents the opportunity for transformation, at least in some instances or some industries, let alone what might happen society-wide. We've heard about some of the productivity gains that could be had. Goldman Sachs had a report that came out last April that talked about global GDP perhaps increasing by 7% because of generative AI. The World Economic Forum talked about this in terms of healthcare, for allowing more accurate, accessible, and sustainable healthcare. And it makes some sense. If you're thinking about a healthcare researcher, being able to employ a model that is very good at detecting patterns and being able to look at large amounts of data and to be able to find connections that a human wouldn't be able to find very easily, you could see some advancements in research that are potentially there. We could also think about something more practical. And this study was looking at a report that discussed how some of these AI tools could be used for better administrative and operational processes. How do we make sure that individuals have better control over their records, and probably more importantly, their healthcare providers can have access to those records in a way that they can find the information they need when they need it? How can they streamline some of the administrative processes that are always difficult to deal with? But I also want to point to other opportunities like this. This is something that I just got this picture today because I read about it just a few days ago. It's a project that Google AI has been doing with a couple of other companies to develop a microscope they call the augmented reality microscope. It's an AI-driven microscope, but it still is an optical microscope that pathologists are using. The concern is a pathologist, it needs to be able to look at cancer cells under the microscope or possible cancer cells to determine is it cancerous or not, and at what stage is it, and what is the likely diagnosis or treatment that we might have. A pathologist has to be able to do that fairly quickly because they have a lot of cases of cancer that they're diagnosing in patients that they're working with. The idea behind this microscope is how can AI assist in that process? And what I like about it is that it's not AI taking over for the pathologist. It's an augmented reality microscope. So when the pathologist looks through the microscope, they can still see the cancer cells, they still see the slide. But then the augmented reality portion from AI takes its own reading of it and can identify patterns, consistencies, connections that maybe the pathologist wouldn't be able to see. So it overlays that augmented reality over what the pathologist can see, so they can see it side by side or one or the other by itself, so they can make better informed decisions. And it gave some great examples in this article about a pathologist that was able to identify, they knew that this patient had cancer, but they weren't sure how aggressive it was. With the AI model, they were able to diagnose it faster, a little bit earlier, and be able to get a better treatment. Now, within business, of course, there are lots of opportunities here for increased productivity. And this McKinsey report talks quite a bit about the potential in different areas of business, so that you could talk about how AI models could take over some of the work that we're doing. And that's generally where we start. How could AI do what it is that I don't really want to do, the drudgery, the boring work? How do I get the AI model to put the cover sheet on my TPS report so I don't have to do it? I think we need to think more expansively, though, and really consider augmentation. How do we use these tools in conjunction with our own efforts so that we can do better work and more productive work, more efficient work in the end? This is a graph that was taken by from a report, a working paper that was just released last week. It was a group of researchers at Harvard and Wharton, including Ethan Mollick, who I mentioned earlier, who were working with Boston Consulting. And since last spring, they've been conducting this big study of several hundred consultants at Boston Consulting. What they did is they randomly assigned groups to a group that would not use AI, but still engage in the same practices, the same workplace, the type of work they'd been doing before. Then they had other groups that would use AI. One group, they trained them how to use AI. The other one, they didn't really train them. They just said, you can use AI. What they found is that those workers that did not use AI did not perform as well, not surprisingly. And you can see a quality improvement from using AI across 18 different tasks. And it's a really fascinating study because it's just an initial study. There's some limitations, and you have to imagine that anybody that's working at Boston Consulting is already pretty proficient and already pretty well trained. But even there, they were able to see a big improvement. What happens if we're able to provide these tools to other workers in other situations so they could make the most of some of these tools and really augment their capabilities? And this is something that we'll be thinking about in terms of the next phase of AI. This is the cover of the book, The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleyman, who is the co-founder of DeepMind, Google, and then Inflection AI. They have a new platform called Pi that's out right now that is really pretty interesting because it's voice activated. It can recognize your voice. It'll give an answer in a voice-based. It's kind of like using Alexa on steroids, where you really have a generative AI model that's able to respond and go back and forth with you. In this book, one of the arguments that Suleyman makes is that generative AI is just one phase. We've moved from general use of AI and background use of AI to generative AI, and we're moving into interactive AI. And he said that's the point where you have interactive use between the user and the model, and maybe doing something a little closer to what that last study was talking about, being able to use it to augment your abilities, to eventually getting to the stage where he said it's kind of like everybody having their own chief of staff in an AI model that can be given tasks and oversight, and then autonomously can then take care of that task and manage that task and do it in a more advanced level over time. That's something we could look into in the business world, but also in other settings. I want to end with a couple of thoughts about education. This is a cover of the book that Sean was mentioning that I worked on that was published last March. And we were concerned it was going to be out of date very quickly. And a lot of what we really talked about there, I think still really holds true in terms of some of the best practices to think about how do you employ these tools in the classroom in a responsible way? How do we better train our students? There are great tools already that are available from companies like Microsoft. This is one I debuted and showed to my students today about Speaker Coach. So when you practice a presentation, you can get immediate feedback from an AI model that'll tell you if you're speaking too fast, always a problem for me, or if you're using too many filler words, or how your eye contact might be. We get into the role of tutor bots, and there are a couple of companies already developing really great models. Khan Academy has one they call Khanmigo that is not just a generative AI that will give answers, but it uses more of a Socratic method, and it will work students through step-by-step how to solve a problem. So if they're working on algebra, it doesn't just tell them, here's the answer to that algebra problem. But if you're having trouble with it, what about this next step? What would you do here? How about if you try this? Then what happens? And it really serves as kind of an interlocutor to help them work through those stages. Other companies like Judy AI have developed this and have made it available for training in areas like AP courses. We're going to see a lot more of this as tutor bots provide individualized instruction in a way that we've never been able to provide before. Then I want to highlight one other tool that I think is really promising as an example of this. We need to be able to train our students how to use these tools. And one way to do it is to build their own. This is a company called PlayLab. It's a nonprofit ed tech company that just came online this summer, and they just started to debut their platform a few weeks ago. I was able to get in touch with the chief technology officer, and he gave my class access. And you can see some of the projects they're already working on. My students in the next week and a half are building their own chatbots. And in those chatbots, they are able to train it with documents that they import and train it based on that document. They have their own prompts built in. They can control the variability, the temperature of the model, as well as which model they're using, if it's GPT or Anthropic's Claude or another version that might be coming out. This is a great way. It's kind of a sandbox for them to test it out, to see what works. And they're able to be more reflective about how the models work, what their best practices might be. And so that when they're using other models in the future, maybe they'll be able to develop some out in the marketplace, but at least they're going to be a little more thoughtful about what they're doing in the future as they're using generative AI. I want to mention one last thing, and this is something that I was arguing for a few weeks ago with some co-authors at the Cottesmore School's Free AI Festival in the UK. We were asked to give a presentation talking about a paper that we just put out, talking about a new model for education. We've all talked about a flipped classroom. I think that a use of an AI tutor bot and perhaps something like a debate model or speaking intensive type model is a great way to address many of the concerns educators have about irresponsible use of AI, like cheating or reliance upon these tools. We need to teach students how to use these tools. They're going to be using these tools when they go out into the workforce, and we're doing them a disservice if we don't teach them how to use them responsibly now. But we can't just say, go and use them and figure it out on your own. So one thing we argued for is that we need to employ what UMW has been doing so well for so many decades, and that is building durable skills. If we think about it this way, employers in the future can hire anyone that can put a prompt into a chatbot and get a response. And if all they do is turn in whatever the chatbot produced, well, anybody can do that. Why would they hire somebody else to do that unless they can do it in some unique, interesting way? But think about employers looking for somebody that can use those chatbots or those AI tools, but also communicate the results effectively with their coworkers or to prospective clients or to an audience. They can think critically about how that chatbot did the work that it was doing and how to be able to get better work, more reliable results as a result of that. They develop a growth mindset, and they can think about in a very mindful way how to collaborate with one another. And these are all the soft skills or durable skills, as I like to call them, that our students at UMW have always been working on with across the curriculum, requirements like SI and WI and digital intensive requirements, and thinking about small classes where they're collaborating and communicating and developing these critical thinking skills. If we employ them with AI models as well, think about how we could augment those skills effectively in the classroom and better prepare our students in the future. Something I'm really excited about, and I certainly want to continue to work with my co-authors to develop this and provide better support for teachers in the future. Now, I realize that we're running out of time. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So let me stop there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to the discussion that follows.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we do have some questions that have been entered, and I appreciate everyone putting those in. Once again, if you see a question that interests you, please vote it up, and it'll move up our list here. But the first question comes from Oscar, and it's what safety guards are being considered to keep this AI from being used for evil, such as asking it to identify a vulnerability in the latest medical device and to create an exploit for it.
It's an excellent question, Oscar. And this is part of the reason why we need better regulation and oversight. It's not that we need government to control all of the mechanisms within the AI industry, but in much the same way that we have some controls for safe search, so that people aren't finding dangerous material online, at least as readily. We need to be able to build those into the models. I think this is going to be a persistent threat. We're talking about developing tools that will augment our current abilities. And right now, the examples that typically come up if it's a terrorist and they want to build a bomb and the AI can teach them how to build a bomb, well, they could probably find that on the internet already, but the AI could make it a lot easier for them to find it and be able to do it. As you said, identifying a vulnerability is a real concern. I think that certainly oversight will help. And I think they can build in some safety guidelines when they're building the model. That's part of the pre-trained portion of the transformer, is that they build in some safety portions. This is something we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but many of these models that we're exposed to now are very general. They're just open wide, so you can talk about most anything. I think that the future is going to lead to what we're seeing some of now, more focused applications and tools. And it's a little easier to put those safety guidelines when you have a healthcare product where you can really control those safety protocols to prevent people from manipulating it or changing it, because it has a very specific task or use.
Great. Okay, next question from Alex. The application of Google's AI to Google Work Suite seems incredible, and personally, I am pumped. But it seems like it would have serious potential antitrust implications given their market share and how regularly regulators come after Alphabet. How do you see their usual defense of competition is just a click away faring with this as one of their services?
It's another excellent question. I mean, I think they're going to be facing some of that, but at the same time, they're not the only game in town. There are a lot of other companies that are producing similar tools. I mentioned just in this week, I've started using two. Bard with one of them that allows me to search all of my Google ecosphere documents and materials, from emails to calendar and so forth. But I also started using Dropbox's Dash, and that's a similar tool that I can then opt in certain materials. With Dash, not only can I include all my Dropbox materials, but also my Google Drive materials or anything on my computer. So I think one of the things that will help is that there'll be a lot of competition in this realm, because it's pretty easy, relatively easy, for somebody to code it in such a way to allow it to train on certain documents. So it's not the same antitrust concern that Google has Google Drive. Nobody else can quite do what it's doing, perhaps with this application. I think that they'll have an easier time saying that there's real marketplace competition, given that there are already other applications that do something pretty similar. And I'm pumped as well. I mean, I think that there's some opportunities here, especially when I'm thinking about a platform that I already have some trust in. I've used Microsoft, I use Google, I already have a lot of documents there. If I have a tool now that is within that same system with the same security and privacy controls, then I have better access to those materials. And I think there are a lot of opportunities there, and we already have seen a few of them come out. I think many more are to come.
Okay, this is from an anonymous attendee. What are your concerns with quantum computing and AI in general?
Quantum computing, I think, brings another realm into this as we start to think about advanced capabilities for a lot of the technology. I think my concerns for AI in general, or AI with quantum computing, fall in line with what some of the perils that I was talking about. I am certainly very concerned about explainability. I just have to wonder, why am I trusting something that I don't think anybody can really understand how it's working or why it's working there? Now, I'm not that worried yet, but I think that these models are developing quickly enough that we need to make sure that the researchers get a hold of that explainability so that they know how to control it or know what to do with it to be able to better guide it. I don't want to just keep pumping more resources into something, hoping that it develops in ways that we haven't seen and that we just are hopefully pleasantly surprised. We might not be so pleasantly surprised in the future if we don't have better control and oversight, whether it's run by the industry or by the government. I think we need to have better explainability and understanding early on.
Okay. The next question is from Karen. How long do you think it will be until generative AI is regularly using live, up-to-date streaming training data?
It's a good question. You know, when we think about ChatGPT being trained on material up to 2021, that was a decision. I think not only because it's easier than maybe having its base and train on streaming data, but also because it limited its capabilities. And there's some that say maybe that was a conscious decision on the part of OpenAI. When we think about training data, every time we interact with the model, unless it's been told not to, it's incorporating that exchange into its training. So this actually was an interesting report that came out this summer. It found that GPT's model, its base model, was actually deprecating. It was not as effective with later results because of its constant use. It continued to change the content that it was drawing from, and because of its interactions, it was not as responsive in some interesting ways. And they really weren't sure exactly why. But what that does suggest is that live streaming training is occurring already. The other thing to keep in mind is that when they start integrating extensions in Bard that include YouTube, they're training on YouTube content. So when they have YouTube videos and they automatically create captions and a transcript, that's so that the systems not only can make it accessible, which is a really great benefit, but it also means that other systems and deep learning models can then read that content and then train on that content. So I think it's already happening on some level at this point, and it probably will even more so. But I think that's where there's some concerns within the industry about making it clear when it's happening, when it's not happening, and if you have control over that. So the last thing I'll say about this, and this is one of the reasons why you were going to see a lot of development in the area of kind of enterprise applications. If you are an attorney and you're working with documents that are legally protected, you shouldn't put those documents into an OpenAI model that is freely available, because it could be training on that material. It's privacy concern. You have a legal responsibility as a lawyer. If you're in business, you have proprietary information that you don't want to just make available. You wouldn't just post it online. Why would you put it in a model that you're not sure what it's going to do with it? Some companies are developing now closed systems, so that if you have an enterprise AI model and you use your materials for your company, it's contained within your model. So it's basically your server, and it can train on it, but it only gets used within your server. So it can just be used internally. So big financial companies have already done this. I think Morgan Stanley, I heard, trained an internal AI model for its analysts, including 100,000 documents that they've used, so that their financial analysts can go and use their internal AI model. And it is continually training, but it's all internal, so it doesn't just become widely used. I think that'll be an important distinction that we'll see. And then there's probably going to be some oversight concern about models making it clear, and the tech companies making clear what's being used, what's not being used, and when.
The next question is from Catherine, and actually she asked two questions. And since just based on your previous answer, I'm going to start with the second one first. And it says, as a researcher, do you recommend we put our research data into these engines, or does this pose a threat to who then owns our data? I read it could be included in someone else's search on a similar topic. So I wonder if there's talk of a good practice.
This is a bit of an open question. And the reason why it's a little bit of an open question is that it's not like these models are recalling data. It's not like if you put it into Google's search algorithm, it could then recall my paper and then give it to somebody else. It doesn't recall it that way. But by putting my paper in, if I think I have some novel idea and I put it into the model, it gets integrated into that neural network. And this is not fully understood exactly how that works, but that then becomes part of the predictive model. So if there are some connections that model finds, then it might start giving output that's reflecting some of those ideas. So I think the best practice is, if you have something that's proprietary, that's personal, that's private, and certainly for any legal purpose, you don't put that into an open model. You don't put that into an open engine in the same way that you wouldn't say, here's my medical health record, WebMD, tell me what do you think I have, because you just don't know who else might have access to it. I think when we're thinking about this as a researcher and we're looking for more content, there's a bit of a fine line that gets really blurry. I like using it for generating ideas, for giving feedback. There are more specific tools I'm a little more comfortable with, like maybe Grammarly, that when I'm thinking about refining or editing a document, I'm not as worried about it taking the content, all of the content in, but then maybe I should be. So I think some of the best practices, be very wary of anything that you wouldn't want out in the public domain being entered into an engine like this or any of these models. And then also start to ask questions about how it's going to be used. You know, when we get into, as you alluded in your follow-up, we talked about maybe an enterprise system being able to be self-contained so that it's secure and it's controlled by the people that own that model, you know, your business. Then it's a little bit safer, I would think, because they have those protocols established. At this stage, it's still kind of the Wild West, and you put a lot of material out there, and you aren't exactly sure how it's going to be used. So I'd say try them out, test them. Don't put material that you're not sure that you wouldn't want to share openly.
And then the final question that we have for tonight, I hear paradigm shift when people talk about generative AI in relation to language learning and teaching. With Google Translate, DeepL, and now generative AI like GPT and Bard. If just disruptive, I think all language teachers can do is learn how to use these platforms for language learning and incorporate them into their classes. But is this naive with things like TutorBot?
You know, that's a really thoughtful way of putting this. I mean, I think when you're thinking about language teachers, I'm assuming you're talking about perhaps somebody that's teaching writing. It's an English course. This is a discussion my colleagues and I have quite often. What do we want the tools to do for us and for our students? And, you know, I don't want to give that up. When I talk to students that are, you know, already proficient writers, they see the value in learning how to develop those skills without AI tools. And if they just start using AI tools too early, then they see that, and I've had many students say this, they would be worried that they wouldn't develop those skills. That's one of the reasons why I think TutorBots are a little better, because they can be geared and trained for particular levels. You know, Khanmigo, one thing I always loved about Khan Academy for my own kids is that it was pretty adaptive for different age groups. And so it was a little more accessible. I think a TutorBot, you wouldn't just give, you know, a kindergartner or a grade school or even a middle schooler just free access to ChatGPT. It's not intended for that, and there are no guardrails. A TutorBot, though, that's intended for a 10-year-old and that really meets all of the certifications, FERPA requirements, and all of the other certifications you have for your school, for instance, then you might be able to have a TutorBot that would help augment their ability, help train them without doing the work for them. And that's one of the reasons I like the TutorBots, because it gives that model of letting them develop those skills while at the same time learning how to use the tools to supplement those skills, to augment those skills. As far as language teachers, language instructors, you know, when we consider even at the college level, if we don't acknowledge the use of generative AI tools, I think we're being naive to think that that means students just aren't going to use them. Many students are acting very honorably. We have a wonderful honor code system at UMW, and I trust our students to say that they aren't going to be using you know, AI in irresponsible or ways that we say they shouldn't be using it. But that's not always the case out in the real world. And I think for some students, it's hard for them to see, why wouldn't I use these tools if they're readily available, if they're going to produce better content, and it makes me a better student. They're not thinking about it just to get by without doing work, but to do better work. And when I think about all the developments that have occurred since I was a high school or college student, and all the ways that those tools have made me a better researcher or writer or presenter and student, I don't want to prevent our students from having that same thing. So we're on a tightrope. We have to figure out, how do we introduce them in a responsible way? And I think we have to have discussions with our students about, these are the responsible practices. This is when it's reasonable to use it. This is when it's not reasonable to use it. And this is what else we can do with these technologies and these tools in class, so that we can get more out of them and better prepare our students for the workforce of the future.
Great. So thank you. Great presentation tonight. We appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Rao. Thank you, Sean, for doing the introduction. I'd also like to thank Mark Simpkins from Events AV, who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of tonight's program. And thanks again to our viewers at home for joining us and being a part of the conversation. Remember that this presentation will be available for viewing on the UMW YouTube channel by this time next week. There you can watch this program and browse the full catalog of MaryTalk. Our 8th season of MaryTalks will continue in November and will feature Kimberly Young, Associate Provost for Career and Workforce, talking about preparing for and thriving in life after Mary Washington. Keep an eye out for more information for our next presentation in October. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier. Thank you and have a good night.